What if the boy who frequently visits the pharmacy isn't just sick, but silently crying for help? He doesn't talk much, doesn't complain, just quietly hands over the prescription and avoids eye contact with adults. But behind every scratch that draws blood, behind every soft-spoken word, like a sigh, something is breaking inside. This is the story of a pharmacist who can't turn a blind eye, a child who's learned to live without daring to be weak, and a father who must learn to see his son before it's too late. In a small pharmacy on the corner of Clark Street, the ticking of the wall clock blended with the soft clinking of plastic bottles as Lucy rearranged the shelves behind the counter. Suddenly, the gentle chime of the door rang out. A tall, thin man entered, followed by a tiny boy. His coat was grey and drab, damp with rain, the sleeves worn. His face was expressionless, just tired, cold, and distant. The boy walked close beside him, clutching a small crumpled bag of medicine tightly, glancing up quickly before looking down again. Lucy recognized them immediately. The man's name was Samuel, a regular customer coming to the pharmacy a few times a month, buying all sorts of things: skin cream, mild sleeping pills, multivitamins. He wasn't much of a talker, and the boy was Daniel. She only knew his name because she once saw it on a prescription. He was quiet, or maybe he had never said anything to Lucy. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice a little hoarse from the cold. Samuel just nodded, not replying. "What do you need today, Samuel?" "Scalp itch relief, for the boy. Seems like he's allergic to something," he replied, his voice as dry as sandpaper. Lucy came out from behind the counter, bent down to look at Daniel, and smiled gently. "Does it itch, sweetie? I can take a look to give you the right medicine." Daniel didn't answer. He just scratched the back of his head, very quickly, then dropped his hand. She noticed his fingers, fingernails bitten short, with red, raw scratches. Lucy frowned slightly. Samuel glanced at them, took half a step back, as if shielding his son. "No need for a thorough examination. I know his skin is allergic. Just give me the medicine." Lucy nodded, but still said softly, "Sometimes itching is caused by fungus, not allergies. If it's fungus, allergy medicine won't work." Daniel scratched again, this time longer. When he lowered his head, Lucy could clearly see the back of his neck. The skin was flaky, red, and inflamed. There was even a pungent smell, like something fermenting. She lowered her voice, moving closer. "Does it hurt when you scratch, Daniel?" The boy looked up, his eyes hesitant. One lower eyelid was slightly dark, possibly from lack of sleep. His voice was as soft as a breath, just enough for Lucy to hear. But she wasn't sure if she heard correctly. "No, it doesn't. If I'm in pain, Dad will get angry with me again." Lucy froze. Not because the words were harsh, but because of the way Daniel said them, without fear, without resistance, just as if he were reciting a rule of life. She looked up, about to say something to Samuel, but he had turned to the shelf next door, as if he hadn't heard. The air in the pharmacy suddenly felt thick. No one said anything more. Lucy quietly returned to the counter, took a mild tube of scalp cream, along with a small packet of antiseptic gauze. She wrapped them carefully in a paper bag and placed it on the counter. "This should be used twice a day, and if it doesn't get better after 3 days, you should take him to a dermatologist," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Samuel gave her cash, without a word of thanks. Daniel stood still, his eyes glancing at the bag of medicine, but he didn't reach out to take it. Lucy had to hand it to him, gently brushing the tips of his fingers as she did. The boy shuddered slightly. As the two father and son left, the door chime rang again. Cold wind blew into the pharmacy, carrying a few scattered raindrops. Lucy stood still for a long moment. Outside the glass door, she saw the backs of the two as they turned into the small alley on the left. Daniel, walking behind, taking short steps and with his head lowered. Lucy turned back, standing in front of the medicine shelf, her hand still holding the empty paper bag. She had met so many people, old, young, sick, healthy. Some grumbled, some thanked her, some asked for endless favors. But Daniel's eyes this morning, they weren't the eyes of a sick child, but the eyes of a child who didn't dare to be sick. A regular customer walked in, Mrs. Sylvia, over 60, coming to pick up her regular blood pressure medication. She was usually talkative, but today, Lucy just nodded slightly, not asking anything as usual. "You look a little tired, Lucy," Mrs. Sylvia said, her voice soft but observant. "Is something wrong?" Lucy hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing, Ma'am. It's probably just too cold this morning." Mrs. Sylvia smiled kindly, took the bag of medicine and walked out. Before leaving the pharmacy, she turned back. "This morning, I passed by and saw that boy with that father of his, skinny as a reed. The little one looked so pitiful. His eyes kept looking down at the ground, as if he was afraid of even a puddle." Lucy nodded slightly, saying nothing. Waiting for her to be out of sight, she returned to her desk. On the table, under the dim yellow desk lamp, the old picture still lay there, an adult and a child, holding hands in the rain. She gently stroked the edge of the paper, then folded it up, carefully, as if folding up a chapter of life. The afternoon came earlier than usual that day. The pharmacy was quiet today. No customers for the past hour. She poured herself a cup of ginger tea and opened the old sales ledger, a habit when she had nothing to do. But this time, Lucy didn't flip through it randomly. She looked for a specific name, Samuel Jenkins. Page after page, the same items, pain relievers, allergy medicine, antibacterial ointment, skin-peeling cream, and even mild sleeping pills, all without a prescription. None of them were real medicine, just temporary patches, like when someone puts a band-aid on a cut that's deeper than they thought. Lucy sat quietly for a long time, her hand stroking the dates. Her eyes stopped at a line that was smeared with ink. 3 weeks ago. Antiseptic, plus multivitamins, plus sleeping pills. She remembered that day, Samuel came alone. Quietly, took the medicine, paid, and left like a shadow. And also that afternoon, Lucy looked up from the ledger, her mind slowly connecting the details. She had seen Daniel. The boy stood in front of the pharmacy, huddled in a grey sweater, a loose hood covering almost half of his face. He was holding a piece of paper. It was after 5 in the afternoon, the weather turning cold suddenly. She remembered because she had planned to close early. Daniel stood close to the glass door, not knocking, not calling, just looking inside as if he didn't dare to intrude on the yellow light. Lucy came out, calling softly, "Daniel!" The boy jumped. The paper fell from his hand. It was a prescription printed from the nearby pediatric clinic. There was no money attached. She asked, "Where's your dad?" He didn't answer. He didn't run away either, just lowered his head, then gradually moved out of the light. At that time, Lucy didn't run after him. She stood at the door, hugging her shoulders tightly, partly because of the cold, partly because she didn't know. If she pulled Daniel back, would she be doing the right thing? That night, Lucy sat at her desk, her phone on her lap, her hand gripping it so tightly that her fingerprints were imprinted on the case. Finally, she opened her contacts, tapped on Carlos Ruiz's name. The ringing rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was hoarse, but alert. "Lucy? What's wrong?" She took a deep breath. I need your opinion on something. About medicine. About a child." Short silence. "Do you remember Samuel? The one who often buys ointment, mild sleeping pills, without a prescription. There's a boy with him named Daniel." Yeah, face like stone. Something's not right, Carlos. I saw that Daniel has skin damage on his scalp, scratching until it bleeds. The boy is scared, doesn't dare to speak. Carlos sighed. Lucy, I understand, but without clear evidence of abuse or neglect, it's difficult to intervene. The boy has injuries, but the doctor hasn't confirmed the cause. You have to be careful. So if I ignore it, and something happens, then what? Then you'll be the one who can't sleep, he replied, his voice dropping. Hanging up, Lucy sat in place. Outside, it started to rain. The next day, she packed a few items into a cloth bag. A tube of mild skin cream, Band-Aids, a bottle of antiseptic. She didn't plan to do anything drastic, just happened to pass by the boarding house where she remembered Samuel had listed his address. The row of boarding houses was low, the walls peeling paint, the hallway dark and damp like an abandoned hospital corridor. Lucy knocked on number 4B, where a dim light shone from the crack under the door. No one answered. She was about to turn away when she heard a soft sound. Turning back, she saw Daniel sitting huddled next to the rug in front of the door. His knees were drawn up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. Next to him was a backpack with a torn strap and a damp, dirty towel. Daniel? The boy looked up, not surprised, not smiling, not asking, just looking at Lucy as if she were a breeze, light and not staying. She walked over, bent down. Why aren't you going inside? Where's your dad? The boy pointed to the door, not saying anything. Lucy knocked on the door gently. A moment later, the door opened. Samuel stood there, dark circles under his eyes, his hair tangled, his shirt collar unbuttoned. His eyes were empty. When he saw Lucy, he frowned, not exactly angry, just tired. Is he bothering you? He asked. Lucy shook her head. Number I just passed by. I saw him sitting outside. I thought he needed something. Samuel glanced at Daniel, then turned back in. He often does that, sits alone. I tell him all the time, but he doesn't listen. Then he closed the door, not saying anything more. The click of the door bolt was like a full stop. Lucy stood still. Daniel still didn't say anything. The night wind whistled softly through the hallway. She placed the bag of medicine next to the boy, not trying to say anything more, just put her hand on his shoulder for a few seconds. The gesture didn't receive any response either. That night, Lucy didn't sleep. She sat in front of the mirror, her hand on her chest, where it throbbed with each beat like repeated knocking. She wasn't a family member, not a doctor, not a police officer, just a pharmacist. But sometimes a pharmacist has to choose to give the right medicine or the right care. She looked at herself in the mirror, speaking softly, as if afraid of hearing herself. I have to do something. Saturday. Sunny, with a light breeze, the temperature lower than forecast. Lucy's pharmacy was unusually busy today. 3 people waiting to pick up prescriptions, 1 person asking about the price of multivitamins, an old woman needing her blood pressure checked. The door chime rang frequently, amplifying the noise in this small space. Lucy was handing a bag of medicine to a customer while glancing at the clock. It was past 10 o'clock. She hadn't seen Samuel return yet. It had been more than a week since she went to the row of boarding houses. She was bending down to get more antiseptic gauze when the door chime rang again. A small figure walked in, old grey sweater, the loose hood covering almost half of his face. The boy approached the counter with a hesitant, unsteady step. When Lucy looked closely, she recognized him. Daniel. He wasn't with Samuel. Lucy stopped talking to the customer, walking softly towards the front of the counter. Daniel stood there, holding a piece of paper. The prescription was printed on A4 paper, with scrawled handwriting in the instructions section. Scalp itch, mild fever, Get medicine like last time." Lucy bent down. "Hello, Daniel. Your dad didn't come with you today." Daniel shook his head. "Dad's asleep. I came instead. I know which one to buy." His voice was hoarse, tired. His lips were dry, pale. Lucy saw that his cheeks were flushed unusually, not from the sun. She looked down at Daniel's hand. His index finger had a red, swollen spot, almost a slight pus. His hand trembled as he held the paper, sweat beading along his forehead, even though it was cold outside. A female customer behind her cleared her throat, reminding her to return to serving. Lucy apologized softly, grabbed a bottle of water she kept in the counter, and gave it to Daniel. "Drink some water and rest. Wait for me a bit. You look a little tired." Daniel hesitated. The boy took the bottle of water but didn't open it. His hand clenched as if afraid of spilling something. Lucy clearly saw each knuckle tense up as if he was holding a heavy, invisible object. "Do you have a fever? Do you have a headache?" she asked softly. Daniel was about to answer, but his lips just moved. Then suddenly his eyes rolled back. His whole body faltered. The water bottle fell to the floor, spilling everywhere. A second later, he collapsed to the floor, his head hitting the edge of the low shelf nearby. The customers screamed. Someone called out, "The boy fainted." Lucy had already knelt down, pulling Daniel away from hitting the shelf again. The boy's skin was burning hot. His forehead was covered in cold sweat. His whole body contracted as if he was trying to shrink into his shell. "Call 911!" Lucy shouted. A young girl took out her phone and called immediately. Lucy put her hand on Daniel's cheek, gently shaking him. "Daniel, can you hear me? Can you hear me?" The boy didn't answer, but in his delirium, his lips moved something. Lucy leaned down to listen. "I'm sorry. I don't want to be hated." His pulse was weak, uneven. Lucy unbuttoned his sweater to make it easier for Daniel to breathe, supporting his head on her knees. The smell of salty sweat mixed with the smell of old medicine left over from half-hearted applications. Less than 10 minutes later, the siren of an ambulance rang out from the end of the street. At the same time, a police officer in a coat rushed into the pharmacy. Carlos. He glanced over the scene and approached Lucy. "What happened?" Lucy didn't have time to answer. She just said one sentence, her voice choked. "He came alone. Fever. Collapsed." The paramedics quickly transferred Daniel onto a stretcher, measuring his heart rate, oxygen saturation. One person said, "Fever over 39 degrees, severe dehydration, possible skin infection." Carlos went with the ambulance. Lucy hesitated for a second, then left the pharmacy to a part-time employee, climbing into the seat next to him. In the ambulance, Daniel was still unconscious, but his head was slightly tilted towards Lucy, as if habitually seeking a warm place. Lucy took his hand, small, thin, cold fingers. She heard her own rapid breathing blending with the siren of the ambulance. Carlos looked over. His eyes were no longer hesitant. He said, "It's not just suspicion anymore." Lucy didn't answer immediately. In that moment, she suddenly realized her hand was shaking. Not because of the cold. She had encountered anaphylactic shock, had handled people fainting due to hypoglycemia in the pharmacy, but had never seen anyone fall with eyes like Daniel's, the eyes of someone who had apologized before being blamed. She turned to Carlos, whispering, "If the boy hadn't come today, then what?" Carlos didn't answer immediately. The ambulance swerved through an intersection, the siren piercing through the dense traffic. "Maybe nothing would have happened," he said. "Or maybe you would have read about it in the news briefs." Lucy closed her eyes. A cold wave ran down her spine. In her head, the words "news briefs" appeared like a dull knife, slowly twisting into her mind. A moment later, The ambulance slowed down in front of the hospital. As the paramedics pushed the stretcher down, Lucy suddenly remembered. When was the last time Daniel smiled? She couldn't remember. Maybe he had never smiled in front of her. The hallway of Mercy Hospital was a quiet white. The hum of the air conditioner whispered through the vents. The smell of antiseptic wafted around each waiting chair like a thin mist. Lucy sat on the cold metal chair, her hands clutching the pockets of her coat, her eyes glued to the small window above the door to the pediatric emergency room. Inside, Daniel was being examined by the doctor. He was admitted with a high fever of 39.4 degrees, dehydration, and a widespread skin infection. A young nurse who came out earlier said quickly, "It's lucky he was brought in time." Carlos stood next to her, pressing his phone to call the Child Welfare Services. His voice was deep, short, unable to hide the tension after many years as a police officer. This time, it wasn't simply suspicion anymore. A moment later, the door opened. A doctor in his 50s, wearing glasses, came out. He pulled down his mask, looked at Lucy. "Are you the one who brought the boy in?" Lucy nodded. "I'm not a relative, but—" "It's okay," the doctor interrupted gently. "We just gave him fluids, lowered his fever, applied antibiotics to the inflamed area. The boy is weak, mildly malnourished. His immune system is reacting poorly. It may be due to unsanitary living conditions or lack of regular care." Lucy felt a warm knife glide through her heart. "Luckily, there hasn't been any blood poisoning, but he needs to be monitored for a few days." "Did he say anything?" The doctor shook his head. "The boy seems wary. When he woke up, he didn't ask to call his parents, didn't cry either, just asked for a small glass of water and apologized for causing trouble." Lucy turned her face away, hiding the hot tears rising up that she couldn't let fall. "You can visit him for a short while." Lucy walked in. The light was softly yellow, the IV drip steadily making a small noise. Daniel lay sideways, the blanket up to his chest. His face was flushed with fever, but his eyes, for the first time, were wide open and looking at her. "Lucy." His voice was hoarse, as soft as the wind through a crack in the door. Lucy sat down next to the bed, taking his hand. "I'm here. How do you feel?" Daniel's lips moved, his eyes reddening, not crying but not daring to smile either. "I don't dare call Dad. I'm afraid of bothering him." The sentence came out like a torn string. Lucy squeezed his hand gently. "You're not bothering anyone, Daniel. You're a child. You have the right to be tired, to be weak." Daniel lowered his eyes. His face reflected the overhead light, like a broken lake. About an hour later, Carlos came back with a nurse. He motioned for Lucy to come outside. "Samuel is coming," he said shortly. "I asked him to sign a temporary care confirmation. We need a signature for the hospital to keep Daniel for treatment." Lucy frowned. "He agreed to come?" "Reluctantly. But the law still gives him guardianship." When Samuel arrived, he was disheveled, his coat wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes as if he had just woken up from a nap. He sat down in the chair in the hallway, not looking at anyone, asking immediately, "How much does he need? And how much will it cost?" Lucy stood up, approaching him. She looked at him, for the first time not with suspicion, but with stifled questioning. "How could you let your child get to this state?" Samuel sighed. Not upset, not angry, just fatigued to the point of numbness. "I work all day. If he doesn't say anything, how am I supposed to know?" Lucy was stunned. "You live with your son. You don't notice him scratching until he bleeds, not eating, having a persistent fever." He looked up at her, his eyes as empty as a riverbed. "I'm tired. I don't know what he needs anymore. Every day I just think about not losing my job, not owing rent. He's quiet. I thought it was good. Lucy couldn't say anything, not because she ran out of arguments, but because the resentment had dissolved into a strange feeling. Pity. Samuel signed the paper, then stood up, not asking how Daniel was, not going in to see him, just saying one sentence. "If you need more money for medicine, tell me." Then he turned and walked away, staggering as if he was carrying a stone that even he didn't know when he started carrying. Lucy watched him, about to turn away, then suddenly stopped. In that moment, he didn't continue walking, but stopped at the corner of the wall at the end of the hallway, one hand against the wall, the other covering his face. His back was bent, his shoulders shaking very slightly. No one but Lucy noticed. A nurse passed by. He immediately stood up straight, continuing to walk as if nothing had happened. She didn't know if it was physical fatigue or something else that even Samuel couldn't name. Carlos walked over, crossed his arms, watching him. "I've seen many bad fathers, but, he hesitated. "I've never seen a father so indifferent." Lucy nodded slightly, but in her eyes, there wasn't pure anger anymore. Instead, there was a feeling of shattering, as if she had just discovered that the man wasn't evil, but empty, because he himself had been broken from before. That night, Lucy returned to the hospital room. Daniel was already asleep. His breathing was even. His fever had gone down. The boy lay sideways, his hand peeking out from under the blanket, curled up as if searching for something in his dreams. Lucy sat beside him, taking his hand. She whispered, as if talking to herself, "I won't go anywhere. You won't be alone." Outside the window, it was raining. But in the room, the light didn't go out. Daniel slept better than the night before. The next morning, when Lucy walked into the hospital room, the boy was awake. He was sitting on the bed, leaning against the pillow, his two small, thin hands gently folding the napkin the nurse had just given him. His eyes were no longer red from the fever, but they didn't really have light yet. "Aunt Lucy," the boy said when he saw her, "I'm not dreaming, am I?" Lucy shook her head softly, sitting down next to him. "No, you're not. You're really here, and you're safe now." Daniel nodded slightly, but instead of smiling, he looked out the window. Around 10 o'clock, Carlos arrived, followed by a young woman wearing a grey shirt and a thin, long coat, Julia, a child psychologist he knew from an old case. She had a voice as soft as a warm towel. Not imposing, not overflowing, just enough to make others want to come closer. "Hello, Daniel," Julia smiled. "I'm Julia. I'm not a doctor. I don't have needles. I'm just here to listen to you tell stories, if you like." Daniel looked at her without blinking. Julia didn't ask anything more. She pulled out a set of colored pencils and some blank sheets of paper from her bag, placing them on the table next to the bed. "I'm very bad at drawing, so if you're better, please help me." Silence for a long time. Finally, Daniel picked up a black pencil. He started to draw. Lucy and Carlos quietly moved out of the glass door. From the hallway, they saw Daniel's small hand moving, hesitating, then slowly but surely. The boy drew a house, a small house with a low roof. There were no lights inside. The door was closed, no windows. Outside, he drew a woman standing with her back turned, long hair, her shoulders shaking slightly, as if crying. Julia didn't rush to ask. She waited until Daniel stopped, putting down the pencil. "Is this your house?" Daniel nodded. "And the woman?" "It's Mom." His voice was as small as a speck of dust falling onto the bed. "She's standing outside the door." "Yes." "Does she want to come in?" "Wants to..." "Then why doesn't Mom come into the house?" Daniel bit his lip, then answered, very softly, "I hear Mom crying out there, but Dad says it's just the wind. Julia slowly moved the drawing closer to herself, then turned it for Daniel to look at again. Have you ever tried to draw Mom inside the house? Daniel shook his head. Not sad, not objecting, just like a habit that was never thought of differently. Because Mom's outside. Julia smiled gently. She didn't argue. Instead, she gave Daniel a light blue pencil. So today, if Mum comes into the house, where will she stand? Daniel looked at the pencil for a moment. Then he suddenly reached out, drawing a very small curve right next to the door, inside the wall. A figure, not clear but no longer turning its back. Lucy, observing from outside, had to turn her face away. Her chest tightened, not because of tragedy, but because of the miracle that was too small. A child who had just dared to change the position of his mother in his mind for the first time. Julia tilted her head, smiling at Daniel, her voice as warm as a hug without touching. Thank you. I think your mum really wants to be in there. At noon, Lucy and Carlos sat in the waiting room for guardians. Carlos had just finished a long call with a former colleague who helped him trace back civil and accident records in the West Chicago area. The information has been confirmed, Carlos said. 8 months after the accident was registered, Samuel's wife, named Claire, was hit by a car while crossing the street, picking up Daniel from school. The car ran a red light. Daniel witnessed it. Standing not far away, the child was 6 years old. No one dared to ask him what he saw that day. Lucy clenched her hands. And Samuel. Carlos flipped through the file. After the accident, Samuel took more than 3 months off work, then moved house, refused psychological support, didn't declare any other relatives, didn't ask for social assistance. For the past 2 years, not a word about his deceased wife. Never mentioned it, didn't tell anyone, didn't let Daniel ask. Silence covered both of them. Lucy said softly, "Maybe." He was too sad. Carlos nodded. Like a fuse blown. No smoke, no explosion, just the light went out, never to be turned on again. Late afternoon, Lucy returned to the hospital room alone. Daniel was drawing more. The new picture was a small chair placed in front of the house, with no one in it. She sat down next to him, not touching him, just sitting close enough. "Daniel." "Yes?" "Do you miss your mum?" Daniel stopped. For the first time, he looked straight into her eyes. The look was unblinking, not afraid, not sad, but like a dagger stabbing neatly into the heart of the person opposite. "I miss Mom's sigh." Then he lowered his head, not saying anything more. Lucy didn't cry, but her heart was like a cloth torn by the wind. No child should live in a house where the sound of the wind is mistaken for the sound of his mother. No child should draw his mother standing outside the door and accept it as an unchangeable fact. The coffee shop was at the end of the street, south of Mercy Hospital, small, old, and a little gloomy. On a weekend morning, the sky was overcast, a cold wind blowing through the cracks in the misty glass doors. Carlos chose the corner table in the back, where no one could hear the conversation if the two of them kept their voices low. Samuel was 15 minutes late, still the same drooping figure, his shoulders hunched in his wrinkled coat, his eyes wandering a few beats out of sync with his steps. He sat down without looking at Carlos. "Did you invite me here to ask me if I plan to sign the paper giving up custody of my son?" His voice was cold and hoarse, as if ground from stone. Carlos didn't react. He just pushed a cup of black coffee across the table. No ice, no sugar. "I invited you here," he said slowly, "not as a police officer." Samuel sneered. "Then what? A teacher teaching how to be a dad? Or a pastor preaching morality?" Carlos shook his head. "A man. Talking to another man. Samuel was about to reply, but Carlos raised his hand, gesturing to stop. "I just want to ask one question," he said. "Just one question, then I'll be quiet." The space froze. The sound of spoons hitting cups from other tables was clear. Carlos looked him straight in the eye. "Since your wife died, has anyone asked you, are you okay?" Samuel froze. His hand was holding the cup of coffee, stopped in midair. His eyelids trembled slightly, not angry, but like a cold gust of wind suddenly sweeping across skin that had been forgotten for a long time. He put the cup down. The silence stretched out like an empty space in a dreamless sleep. Then, unexpectedly, Samuel burst into tears. Not loudly, not collapsing, just 2 lines of tears sliding from the deep sockets, flowing without a sob. "I feel like I died with her that day." Samuel clenched his hands, his 10 fingers pressing into each other until they turned white. He raised his head, his eyes reddened, but his gaze no longer running away. "That morning, Claire woke up early, preparing sandwiches. She touched my shoulder gently. The last touch. I didn't open my eyes. I just said, 'You can go alone.'" He laughed, as if mocking himself. 3 minutes later, someone knocked on the door to report the accident, and I didn't have time to say anything. Didn't have time to take a breath and see her alive for the last time. Carlos squeezed his friend's shoulder very gently. "You didn't kill her," he said, "but if you continue to imprison yourself in that day, Daniel will lose his father in a way that no one sees." Samuel lowered his head. For the first time he nodded. "I live like an empty shell. Every day is just avoiding remembering, avoiding crying, avoiding looking at him because he has Claire's eyes." Carlos sighed very softly. He nodded. "Now, you have 2 choices," he said softly. "Either continue to avoid or start to step out." At the same time, at the hospital, Lucy and Daniel sat by the table next to the window. The morning light streamed in dimly, enough to clearly see the scissors, colored paper, pencils, and a folded cardboard that Daniel was cutting and pasting. "Are you making a card?" Lucy asked. "Yes," Daniel nodded. "For someone special." "Who is it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was absorbed in pasting the figures of 2 people standing next to each other, an adult and a child. Below were the sun and 3 bold letters, GOUTWITHME. Lucy leaned down, reading the small print Daniel was writing. "If Dad still remembers my name." Her heart ached. Daniel stopped a few times, his eyes pensive not because of choosing colors, but as if he was in dialogue with something that wasn't here. "Do you want to write anything else?" Lucy asked. Daniel bit his lip. Then he wrote a small line in the lower corner of the card. "If Dad doesn't remember my face, then this is me and Dad." I drew it. Lucy choked up. The 6-year-old boy had prepared for the possibility that the father he loved might have forgotten the shape of his child. In the afternoon, Samuel returned to the hospital. He walked slowly, his hand still trembling slightly. Not because of the cold, not because of fatigue, but because for the first time he felt like he was walking towards his son, not passing through him like a ghost in a familiar hallway. Lucy greeted him at the door of the room, not saying anything. She just nodded, then stepped aside to let him in. Daniel was sitting on the bed, holding the card. When he saw his father, he stood up. "I have this," Daniel said, holding out the card. "I drew 2 people in this, but Dad has to choose. Go out with me, or stay in the darkness alone again." Samuel didn't answer. He looked at the card. The sun was bright yellow. 2 simple human figures holding hands, a tree next to them, and a cloud shaped like a heart, drawn with a red pencil. His hand trembled. He knelt down in front of Daniel. "I'm sorry, Daniel." Silence for a long time. Then, as soft as the wind, through a half-closed door, the boy replied, "I still want to have a dad, but a dad who knows how to look at me." Samuel didn't say anything more. He just held out his hand. And for the first time in 2 years, Daniel stepped forward, taking his father's hand. Daniel was temporarily discharged on Monday morning when the doctor confirmed that his physical condition had stabilized, but he still needed psychological monitoring and a stable living environment. Lucy was the one who took him home, not to the old boarding room, but to a short-term rental apartment near Riverside Park. This place was found by Carlos, and the community center supported the costs for the first month. Samuel greeted his son at the door. He was wearing a clean shirt, his hair neatly combed, although his expression was still dazed, as if he himself wasn't sure he belonged in that scene. Daniel stepped forward, holding a small bag, his eyes searching. "Hello," Samuel said softly. "Hello, Dad," Daniel replied, his eyes not looking away. They didn't hug each other, but they didn't avoid each other either. The next morning, Samuel took Daniel to the end of the street, to a small diner with a few old wooden tables. This was the first time in 2 years that he had actively taken his son out to eat. They sat opposite each other. On the table was a plate of fried eggs and toast. "Do you want some eggs?" Daniel asked, picking up his fork. Samuel paused, his eyes slightly blank. "I don't remember the last time I ate." Then he picked up a piece of egg, chewing slowly. Daniel was silent, but his face had something relax, as if he was waiting for something that had never happened to begin again. 3 days later, Samuel went to his first group therapy session. The community activity room was on the 3rd floor of an old library. 7 people sat in a circle, mostly single parents. Some had just lost their wives. Some were raising autistic children. Samuel sat on the edge of the circle, no one forcing him to speak. The second session, he was still silent. The third session, when an older man recounted that he had to learn how to braid his daughter's hair again, because she said her hair being pulled hurt her heart. Samuel laughed, a very small but clear sound. Then he said, without anyone forcing him, "I used to hear him crying in the room, but I didn't dare open the door. I was afraid he would ask, 'Where's Mom?'" The whole circle was silent. Not a word of advice, not a pat on the shoulder. Just a silent empathy. The kind of silence people give each other when someone dares to place their pain on the table in the light. Samuel felt like he wasn't standing outside anymore. For the first time, he wasn't ashamed of his tears. He no longer felt weak, just like a normal human being when losing someone he loved the most. Another man in the group, Salt and Pepper Hair, said, "I lost my wife when my son was 4. I didn't know how to do hair, but every time I asked, 'What style do you like?' he smiled, and from then on I learned to ask questions instead of trying to guess." In the late afternoon, Lucy stopped by to take Daniel for a checkup and conveniently brought some old toys from her storage room. When she saw Samuel standing on the balcony, carefully hanging some small potted plants on the window frame, she stopped for a moment. "Try starting by watering the plants with Daniel every morning," Lucy said, pointing to the water bottle placed at the foot of the chair. "Or reading a story before bed. Even if it's just 3 pages, he'll remember every word." Samuel nodded. He didn't argue, not pushing back anymore. That night, for the first time, Samuel sat on the upholstered chair next to his son's bed, holding an old book, Squidward the Squid and Starfish, the one that Claire used to read to Daniel. His voice was a little stiff at first, each word like a footstep on ice. But by the 3rd page, Daniel had rested his head on his hand. His eyes had closed at some point. Samuel stopped reading. He didn't pull his hand away, just sat there, silently. He looked at his son. It had been a long time since he had really looked at his son. not to check on him, not to fulfill his responsibilities, but to see. A small, peaceful face, not frowning. Soft hair, starting to grow longer after the hospital days. His hand was still clutching the corner of the blanket, as if afraid of losing his balance in his dreams. Samuel lowered his head, his forehead gently touching his son's hair. A soft, warm, not harsh feeling, like Claire used to put on his shoulder on old winter mornings. He didn't cry, but something welled up inside. Not pain, not stinging, just like a person starting to breathe with their own chest. Before turning off the light, Samuel suddenly remembered something lying in his pocket. It was a blue pencil, old but still able to write. Daniel had left it at the hospital with a note attached. For Dad, so Dad can draw what he remembers. Samuel looked at the pencil for a long time. He didn't know what he would draw, but just having it in his hand was an invitation. Try to remember, dare to name what he had buried. He put the pencil on the table next to the bed, right next to the book, Squidward the Squid. Then, he turned off the light. The night light was dimly yellow. Daniel lay sideways, the blanket covering him to his chest. Samuel sat next to him, resting his head on his hand, dozing off. For the first time in 2 years, the two father and son slept peacefully in the same room, not two separate worlds. Claire wasn't there, but there was still a gentle light. No more crying outside the door, but the even breathing of two people who knew they still had each other. To start again. The wall clock in the meeting room still ticked steadily, each passing tick of the hands clearly audible in the silence of the cold, white room. The light from the window shone on Dr. Luis's face, drawing faint streaks of light on the paper in front of him. Lucy sat close to Daniel. Her hand was gently placed on the boy's shoulder, like a silent anchor. Samuel sat opposite, his hands clasped together, his calloused fingers motionless on his knees. He wore a dark-colored shirt, the collar still bearing the creases from its last ironing. "Daniel," Dr. Luis smiled, his voice deep but gentle. "Do you want to tell me anything about lately?" The boy glanced at his father for a second, then turned back, his eyes lighting up a little. "Yes. I can scratch my head when it itches, without being afraid of being scolded anymore." No one laughed, but in the small room, the atmosphere seemed to soften. Lucy looked at Samuel. He looked up, his eyes a little surprised. A form of gentle surprise that he didn't seem used to receiving. He didn't say anything, just nodded very slightly. The doctor nodded. That's an important change. Natural behaviors, if controlled too much, can leave lasting feelings of fear. Daniel feeling safer to do that simple thing means that the door to trust is opening. Outside the glass door, the April sky no longer had the chilly dampness of early spring, but still retained the gentleness that made people want to go outside. "What else?" Lucy asked softly, leaning towards Daniel. He thought for a moment. "Me and Dad. I can lie next to Dad without being afraid. Some days I fell asleep on his shoulder. Dad didn't wake me up, just covered me with a blanket." Samuel exhaled slowly, as if holding something from falling apart. He closed his eyes for a short blink, then opened them, a little calmer. The park that afternoon carried the scent of fresh grass after last night's rain. Lucy spread the checkered cloth under a willow tree near the lake. Daniel sat on the grass, busy with the scraps of colored paper and colored pencils that had run out of lead. Samuel stood not far away, holding a half-finished cup of cold coffee. He was watching his son running back and forth, chasing the squirrel that had just jumped onto the branch of the tree. "Before," Samuel said, not taking his eyes off his son, "she really liked lilacs. You know, every early April she had to buy a bouquet. That smell. It was like the season coming home." Lucy looked at him. Danielle told me his mum used to hold him by the window, reading books to him. He nodded. When Danielle was 3, he had a high fever once, delirious for 3 days straight. My wife. She stayed up watching him, still holding the book of fairy tales, reading it over and over, even though he didn't wake up. He smiled softly, pursing his lips. Lucy didn't interrupt. They sat next to each other, like two people listening to the waves lapping from the lake. A moment later, she quietly opened her bag, taking out a picture. Daniel drew it secretly. I think you should see it. In the picture, the strokes were still immature but full of effort. 3 people stood next to each other, Daniel, Samuel, and a woman who wasn't clear-faced, just a soft blur, her hands as if gently pushing the 2 father and son together. Danielle's face in the picture was smiling, and Samuel was tilting his head towards his son, his eyes as if they had just been restored. Samuel held the picture for a long, long time. The afternoon light reflected into his eyes, darkening his pupils. I think, Lucy said softly, maybe he's forgiving you now. And his mother too. Samuel didn't answer. He just looked at the lake, where the fallen petals from the willow branches were floating. But this time, he didn't avoid the question. The next doctor's appointment also ended in positive progress. Dr. Luis put the file away, sitting quietly for a moment before saying, "We can't say Daniel has fully recovered. But clearly, the process is going in the right direction. The traumas can't disappear, but he's learning how not to be swallowed by them. And most of all, he's learning how to name them. He doesn't have to hide anymore." Lucy looked at Samuel. For the first time in months, the father's face didn't shrink with guilt. He was simply sitting there, like a normal person, with acknowledged regrets and a sincere desire to do better. Before leaving the park, Daniel slipped something wrapped in a small handkerchief into his father's hand. "For Dad," the boy said. Samuel opened it. It was a plastic flower, its petals slightly chipped, the stem wrapped with wire. The purple color had faded, but still reminiscent of lilacs. "Mum's from before. I made it again so Mum wouldn't be forgotten." Samuel's hand trembled slightly. He bent down, hugging his son. Not a word was uttered, but in that light squeeze, something was being released. Not completely, but it was a beginning. Early one morning, Samuel woke up when it was still dark. He quietly opened the closet, chose the old coat he had already washed, then placed a small note on the kitchen table. "Dad's at the construction site. Remember to bring a raincoat." When he turned around, he saw Daniel standing leaning against the door of the room, his hair still tousled, holding a stuffed bear. The boy's eyes were no longer as fearful as they had been in the previous months, but still carried the wariness of someone who had lived too long in uncertain days. "Are you going to fix the electricity?" Daniel asked, yawning. "Yeah, Lily's house has a broken circuit breaker. She called yesterday," Samuel said, then bent down to tie his shoelaces. "Can I go to school alone?" Samuel looked up. Daniel said quickly, his eyes blinking slightly, "I know the way. The teacher said we're learning to draw today. I want to get there early to get the blue before the other kids." Samuel smiled softly. He walked over, ruffling his son's hair. "Walk slowly. Remember to look both ways when crossing the street." Daniel nodded. A normal day begins like that. Nothing special, but for them, it was a form of courage, to stand up on their own and go out, despite the fear that once ruled their hearts. Clark Elementary School has a blue painted iron gate, old and peeling. When Samuel arrived, students were starting to leave. He stood behind the iron gate, hesitating. This was the first time he had picked up Daniel after school. The children rushed out like birds released from their cages. Samuel stood close to the fence, searching for the familiar figure among that small crowd. And then he saw Daniel. Not alone, not huddled in the corner like the first day he went back to school. The boy was smiling, saying something to a little girl with pigtails on both sides. He was holding up a drawing, both showing off and explaining something very excitedly. Samuel didn't interfere. He just stood there, leaning against the gate post, his eyes as if drawn by the scene in front of him. Something sparkled in his chest. Not pride, and not exactly happiness, but something gentler, the recognition that his son was gradually growing up, and he was no longer the terrifying shadow in his eyes. Daniel saw him when the boy turned his head to look for the person holding his pencil case. His eyes lit up. He ran over, without hesitation. "Dad's here early." He cheered, then shoved the drawing into his hand. In the picture were two hands, one big, one small, holding each other in the rain. The raindrops were drawn with light blue, falling separately around them. But the hands still didn't let go. Samuel didn't say anything, but his fingers squeezed the edge of the paper lightly, keeping the drawing from flying away. That night, the weather became windy. The two father and son ate dinner in silence. When they had finished cleaning up, Daniel suddenly spoke when Samuel was plugging in the nightlight. "Are you still sad about Mom?" Samuel looked up. The boy's eyes didn't avoid him. "Yes, I never stopped missing Mom," he replied, honestly. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sad too. But if we're sad together, maybe it's lighter." Samuel didn't know what to say. He just pulled the chair back, sitting down next to his son, his hand on the back of the chair. Daniel leaned into his hand, his head tilting onto his shoulder, as if seeking a support that he now knew wouldn't collapse anymore. On the weekend, Lucy organized a small party in the pharmacy, some acquaintances, some hospital staff, and some children who used to come and play with Daniel. She hung sparkling lights along the glass door, placed a small wooden table in the corner filled with cookies and juice. Daniel wore a white shirt, holding a quarter-folded piece of paper. When Lucy nodded to signal, he stepped forward, hesitated slightly, but then read each word clearly, his voice a little shaky but full of emotion. "I will grow up if Dad stands next to me. Not always talking, but there, like shade in the midday sun. Not needing to cover everything, just enough for me to know, take one more step. There's still someone behind me." Lucy clapped first, then everyone clapped. Samuel stood at the end of the corner of the room, his hands clenched together, his eyes watery. He couldn't stop himself from walking forward, hugging his son tightly. Daniel stayed still in his arms, then whispered in his ear, "I wrote another line, but I didn't dare read it." "What line?" Samuel asked. "And if Dad steps back a little, I will still move forward," Daniel said. Then raised his head, his eyes clear, not afraid of being misunderstood, not afraid of hiding anything anymore. That night, in the dim light of the nightlight, Samuel opened his wallet. In the compartment next to the place for money, he slipped in a small piece of paper that had been carefully folded. Inside was the picture Daniel had recently drawn. Two father and son sitting under the tree. In the distance, some birds flying. The faces of both were not detailed, just simple lines, but it was easy to recognize the posture of sitting close together, peacefully. Samuel stroked the picture lightly, folded it, then put it in his wallet. When he turned off the light, he turned to look at Daniel, who was sleeping. A deep and light sleep, as if he had never known the days of uncertainty. He thought, normalization isn't about forgetting. It's about continuing to live, even though the memories are still there. A normal evening, A normal school day. A wallet with a new picture. Small things. But for them, those were silent victories. That night, it rained as if someone was tapping rhythmically on the old wooden eaves. The small light bulbs hanging around the window frame of the pharmacy blinked because the cold wind blew sideways, the light dim as if breathing. Lucy sorted each glass jar into a cardboard box, her hand slowly, not in a hurry. Each label, each small scratch on the wooden shelf brought back the moments she had lived here. Nothing great, but enough to make a person's heart contract a little. She put the sign, "For sale, there's a successor," in the corner of the glass door, then walked towards the old counter, where the drawer hadn't been opened for a long time. When she pulled it out, inside were some old bills, a plastic ruler, and a quarter-folded piece of paper with worn corners. It was Daniel's drawing. A grown-up standing in the rain, his coat blowing lightly in the wind. No umbrella, no hat. One hand hanging down, the other holding the hand of a child. Small, but walking without cowering. The rain was drawn with pencil, broken lines, but the drawer had used all his heart to express the peace in it. Lucy touched the edge of the paper with her fingertip, her heart constricting. She whispered, as if talking to herself, "We didn't do anything great. We just didn't give up." The previous afternoon, Daniel visited the pharmacy as usual. He didn't say much, just wiped the dust off the medicine shelves along the wall, then cleaned the box of Band-Aids. When he was done, Lucy was about to slip a pack of oat cookies into his hand as usual, when Daniel stopped, taking out a carefully folded letter from his coat pocket. I wrote it a long time ago," he mumbled, his eyes not looking straight. "Now I can probably give it to you." Lucy opened the letter after Daniel left. The handwriting was still clumsy, but straight, as if the writer had been very careful. To Lucy, "If you hadn't stayed with me that day, I would have been silent forever. I don't remember what you said first, but I remember the sound of you pulling up the chair, the sound of you sighing, and the sound of the pen you tapped lightly on the table as if you were thinking of something. I remember you didn't ask, pushing, didn't avoid, just there. Once you said, 'No one deserves to live alone with sadness.' I believe it now. Thank you for staying. Daniel." That rainy night, Samuel knocked on Lucy's door. He was wearing a dark khaki coat, one shoulder wet from the wind. In his hand was an old insulated bag, the kind people usually use to carry lunch. "Have dinner with me, would you?" he asked, his voice still carrying the familiar embarrassment, but this time not avoiding her eyes. Lucy smiled softly, inviting him in. The small kitchen was familiar with the smell of mint and medicine. Now it was fragrant with the smell of stir-frying, simple but heartwarming. "The first time I cooked since she died," Samuel said, sitting down opposite her. "Not to replace, just felt like it was time for someone to eat together." Lucy didn't reply. She just nodded and had her first dinner with him, not under the party lights, but in the steady rain tapping on the window frame. At the elementary school, at the end of term presentation, the teacher asked the students to share what they had learned over the past year. Not math or history, but lessons from life. When it was his turn, Daniel stood up, his voice even but clear. "Before, I thought silence was safe. If I didn't speak, no one would be angry, no one would be sad. But now I know, speaking out is brave." A moment of silence in the class. Then a few claps rang out, not bustling, but sincere. The day Lucy locked up the pharmacy for the last time, it was still raining. Samuel and Daniel came to take her to her car. The boy held an umbrella for her, but she only held the handle lightly, then let it slant to one side, as if not wanting to be completely shielded from the rain falling for the last time on the familiar steps. "I'll visit again, if you don't mind," Daniel said, when he took her to the car. Lucy gently touched his cheek. "I'll always wait." Samuel stood next to her, not saying much, but his eyes were relieved, not because it was over, but because he had been able to accept it without feeling empty. That evening, when the rain still hadn't stopped completely, Daniel and Samuel walked together on the small street leading home. The two walked slowly, not carrying an umbrella, not running away from the rain. Samuel's coat started to get wet. Daniel looked up at the sky, letting a few raindrops fall on his eyelids. He turned to his dad. "You don't need to be perfect," he said, his voice not loud but certain. "You just need to stay." Samuel didn't answer immediately, but his hand touched his son's shoulder lightly. Not squeezing, not pulling, just enough for Daniel to know he wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes what hurts a child isn't scolding, but silence that lasts so long that he no longer knows who to call safe. It's the times he has a fever and no one asks, the scrapes no one notices. When he learns that, being good is being silent. When it hurts, don't say anything. And when you're tired, you can't rest. This story doesn't have a dramatic rescue scene. No heroes. Just a pharmacist looking longer for a few seconds, listening longer to a short answer. A boy who once apologized just for being sick. And a father who once believed that keeping silent was the only way to continue living. You may have never worked in some old pharmacy on the corner, never seen a child faint right in front of you. But if you've ever been silent so as not to bother, ever thought you had to be healthy to be loved, then maybe you'll understand. Thank you for staying until the last line. If you come across a small gaze that's looking down for too long, I hope you're gentle enough to step back and ask, "Are you okay?" Because sometimes a question at the right time is the first way to keep someone staying with this world.